For 30 years, Johnny Carson ruled late-night television. Over 2 decades and more than 22,000 guests sat across from him at The Tonight Show desk. Actors, comedians, politicians, even royalty. They all came to impress the king of late night. But here's what most people don't know. Carson wasn't easily impressed. He was famously private, cautious, and even cold at times. On camera, he smiled. Off camera, he kept his distance. His crew knew very few people ever broke through that icy wall. Yet, every once in a while, a rare guest would do the impossible. Someone who didn't just play the game, but actually got Carson to let down his guard. Sometimes that meant bringing out his goofy side with wild pranks. Other times it meant exposing his hidden vulnerability, even moving him to tears in front of millions of viewers. And in one unforgettable case, it meant Carson openly bowing down to someone else's legacy, admitting on air that he was sharing the stage with true television royalty. These weren't just guests. They were the chosen few who revealed Johnny Carson's real self, the man behind the perfectly tailored suit and the sharp one-liners. So who were they? From unpredictable pranksters to timeless legends, to one emotional moment that shocked America. These are the 5 guests Johnny Carson loved the most. When Bert Reynolds walked onto Johnny Carson's stage, the atmosphere instantly changed. The usual Tonight Show rhythm, polite banter, rehearsed stories, a few predictable jokes, was thrown out the window. With Bert, you never knew what was coming next, and Carson loved it. At the height of his fame in the 1970s, Reynolds wasn't just a movie star. He was one of the most recognizable men in America. Charismatic, mischievous, and always ready to push boundaries, he treated Carson's stage less like an interview spot and more like a playground. And that unpredictability, it was exactly what Carson craved. Unlike most celebrities who showed up with carefully prepared talking points from their publicists, Reynolds came armed with something much more dangerous, a sense of humor that refused to play by the rules. One night, he pulled a prank so outrageous that the audience couldn't believe what they were seeing. Right in the middle of what was supposed to be a serious discussion about his latest film, Reynolds suddenly smeared a handful of shaving cream directly across Carson's face. Now think about this for a second. Johnny Carson, the most polished man in late night, sitting there with foam dripping from his chin on live television. Most hosts would have been furious. Most guests would have killed their careers pulling a stunt like that. But Carson? He roared with laughter. According to staff who were there, he was laughing even harder during the commercial break than he did on camera. That was the magic of Bert Reynolds. He didn't just come on to promote a movie. He came to play. And Johnny recognized that immediately. He once told a producer, "Bert gets the game." Most guests don't. What Carson meant was simple. Late night wasn't supposed to be a rigid sales pitch. It was supposed to feel alive, spontaneous, even a little dangerous. And Reynolds delivered that every single time. Their chemistry became legendary. Reynolds would toss out a mischievous line, Carson would volley back, and soon the two of them were trying to one-up each other like old friends locked in a never-ending prank war. The audience ate it up because it wasn't just entertainment, it was real. But here's the key detail that separated Reynolds from everyone else. He could take a joke just as well as he could dish one out. Carson had a habit of poking fun at his guests, and many stars hated it. Their egos were too fragile, their images too carefully managed. But not Bert. If Carson made a jab at his flopped movies or his very public love life, Reynolds would laugh louder than anyone. That mattered to Carson more than people realize. A longtime producer once revealed Carson's secret test for liking a celebrity. Could he tease them without them getting offended? Bert passed that test with flying colors. Not only did he laugh at Johnny's jokes, he encouraged them. Off stage, Carson even used Reynolds as an example to coach nervous first-time guests. He'd tell them, "Relax and just have fun with it," like Bert does. That was the highest praise Johnny could give. For a man like Carson, who built his career on control, Bert Reynolds was the rare guest who could break that control and make him enjoy it. Their appearances together weren't interviews. They were unpredictable, hilarious battles of wit and mischief. And in Johnny's book, That made Bert Reynolds one of the all-time greats. If Bert Reynolds brought chaos and pranks to Carson's stage, Bob Newhart did the opposite, and that's exactly why Johnny adored him. Where Bert was wild and unpredictable, Bob was calm, understated, and effortlessly hilarious. He didn't need shaving cream, water pistols, or outrageous antics. All he needed was a story, a pause, and that perfectly dry delivery that made America fall in love with him. Carson once called Bob Newhart the most effortlessly funny man I know. And coming from Johnny, that wasn't just a compliment, that was a crown. Unlike many comedians who came on the show armed with polished routines or recycled material, Newhart treated the Tonight Show couch like a living room. He never seemed like he was performing, he just talked. And that natural flow matched Johnny's style perfectly. It was almost like watching two jazz musicians riff. Bob would start a story with his classic deadpan tone. Johnny would toss in a perfectly timed quip, and Bob would build on it without missing a beat. Back and forth, smooth and sharp, they had a rhythm that was impossible to fake. A director from the show once said, "It was like they could anticipate each other's next move before it even happened." Carson respected that more than anyone realized. Normally, he was strict about timing. Segments had limits. Commercials had to roll on schedule. But with Bob Newhart, the rules didn't apply. If Newhart was on a roll, Johnny would flash the signal to delay the break. He'd tell producers, "Let him go." Yeah, just let him go. That kind of flexibility was almost unheard of on The Tonight Show. And here's another reason Johnny valued him so much: humility. Despite his success, sitcoms, stand-up albums, sold-out shows, Newhart never walked in with an entourage or diva demands. He was polite to the crew, remembered names, and always treated people with respect. Carson noticed those little things. In fact, he hated prima donnas. If a star acted entitled, Johnny would never warm up to them. Bob was the exact opposite, and it showed. Their friendship even extended beyond the studio. Every now and then, Johnny would invite Bob out to play golf, something he almost never did with celebrities. For Carson, golf wasn't about publicity, it was personal time. And if you made it into that circle, it meant Johnny truly liked you, not just as a guest, but as a person. That's why Newhart stood out. He didn't just make Carson laugh, he made him comfortable. With Reynolds, it was all about the thrill of unpredictability. With Newhart, it was about the quiet confidence of knowing the laughs would come naturally, without forcing a thing. In a world of celebrities trying too hard, Bob Newhart never had to. And Johnny loved him for that. Johnny Carson was the master of control. Night after night, he stood unshaken in front of millions, delivering monologues, cracking sharp jokes, and guiding conversations with ease. He didn't flinch, he didn't stumble, and he almost never let his real emotions slip through. But then came Jimmy Stewart, and in a single moment, the unflappable Johnny Carson broke. Stewart wasn't just another guest. To Carson, he was Hollywood royalty. More than that, he was everything Johnny respected in a man: humble, genuine, and completely untouched by the slickness of show business. While many aging stars leaned on rehearsed stories and polished anecdotes, Stewart was different. He hesitated. He searched for words. He was simply himself. And that authenticity made Carson drop his guard in a way no one else could. The moment that sealed their bond happened in 1981. Stewart came on The Tonight Show not just as an actor, but as a poet. He read a piece he had written about his beloved golden retriever, Bo. It was simple, raw, and heartbreakingly sincere. As Stewart's trembling voice carried through the studio, the audience grew silent. Then the cameras cut to Carson, and for the first time, America saw the late-night king fighting tears. Johnny didn't hide behind a joke. He didn't change the subject. He let the moment live. His eyes welled, his expression softened, and suddenly, the most guarded man on television was just another dog lover grieving alongside a friend. A cameraman who was there later said, "I'd never seen Johnny react like that." He wasn't performing anymore, he was just being human. That's exactly what made the moment so unforgettable. Millions of viewers realized in that instant that Johnny Carson, the man who always kept his emotions hidden, could be cracked wide open by the honesty of Jimmy Stewart. From then on, Stewart's appearances became sacred. Carson's staff noticed how differently Johnny treated those nights. If Stewart was scheduled, Johnny would personally ask to extend his segment. He'd even tell producers, "Move the commercial if you have to. Give Jimmy a few more minutes." That kind of flexibility almost never happened on The Tonight Show. Johnny Carson was known for keeping his cool. No matter what happened, a joke that flopped, a guest who froze, even technical glitches on live TV, Johnny always stayed calm, smooth, and in control. That composure became his trademark. But there was one man who managed to reach past that armor. Someone who pulled a raw emotion out of the most unflappable host in television history. That man was Jimmy Stewart. To Johnny, Stewart wasn't just a movie star. He was a symbol of everything Carson admired: dignity, humility, and authenticity. Stewart didn't try to dazzle anyone when he came on the show. He wasn't polished or slick like many Hollywood veterans. In fact, he sometimes stumbled over his words, pausing to find the right phrase. But that only made him more endearing to Johnny. It felt real, and Carson valued real above almost anything else. The moment that etched Stewart's place in Tonight Show history came in 1981. That evening, instead of promoting a new project or sharing a funny story, Jimmy decided to read a poem. It was about his golden retriever, Bo, who had recently passed away. The verses were simple, almost plain, but they were honest. So honest that they cut right through the cameras, the studio lights, and the usual walls of late-night entertainment. As Stewart's voice trembled with emotion, the room fell completely silent. The audience stopped laughing. The band stopped fidgeting. Everyone just listened. And then, the camera cut to Johnny Carson. What viewers saw stunned them. Johnny's eyes were wet. His expression softened in a way America had never seen. And then, for one brief, unforgettable moment, the king of late night visibly teared up on national television. He didn't crack a joke to ease the tension. He didn't deflect with a witty line. Instead, he let the moment exist. Millions of people at home realized they weren't watching Johnny Carson, the performer. They were seeing Johnny Carson, the man. Crew members who worked that night never forgot it. One camera operator said later, "I'd been filming Johnny for years and I'd never seen him react like that." He didn't hide it. He let himself be human. That was shocking in itself, because Carson usually hated exposing any vulnerability. But with Stewart, it just happened naturally. After that episode, Stewart became more than just a beloved guest. He was sacred to Carson. Producers noticed Johnny would go out of his way whenever Stewart was booked. He'd ask them to extend his time, even telling staff to move commercials or push back other guests just to give Jimmy a few extra minutes. That was unheard of in Carson's world, and the respect lasted right to the end. When Carson retired in 1992, he personally called only a small handful of people to thank them. Jimmy Stewart was one of them. Think about that. After 30 years, thousands of interviews, and over 22,000 guests, Stewart was one of the very few Johnny chose to reach out to. Why? Because Stewart represented something Johnny rarely found in Hollywood: honesty without ego. He wasn't trying to sell anything. He wasn't trying to outshine the host, and he wasn't trying to put on a mask. He was just Jimmy, a man who loved his dog, who loved his craft, and who wasn't afraid to be vulnerable in front of millions. And for Johnny Carson, who spent most of his life carefully hiding his own vulnerability, that was powerful. It was unforgettable. And it made Jimmy Stewart one of the most important guests he ever had. By the time George Burns was appearing on The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson, he was already well past the age when most entertainers had retired. But Burns wasn't just active, he was thriving. In his 80s, 90s, and even past 100 years old, George Burns was still sharp, still funny, and still delivering lines that left audiences doubled over with laughter. For Johnny Carson, George Burns wasn't just another guest. He was living history. Burns came out of vaudeville, the old-school hand-to-mouth world of traveling acts and smoky theaters that had laid the foundation for modern comedy. Carson himself had grown up idolizing that world, learning timing, misdirection, and the art of holding an audience. When George Burns sat across from him, Johnny wasn't just hosting a talk show. He was sitting at the feet of a master. Crew members said Carson would actually get nervous before Burns came on. Think about that. Johnny Carson, who'd sparred with presidents, movie stars, and some of the biggest names in show business, would get butterflies introducing a man in his 90s holding a cigar. One producer compared it to a concert pianist about to play for Mozart. And what made Burns so remarkable, and so respected by Johnny, was that he kept getting better. Most comedians peak in their prime and then slowly recycle old material. But George, he just kept evolving. Even in his late 90s, he would show up with fresh material, new observations, and razor-sharp timing. Carson loved that. He once said, "Most of us peak and then hang on. George just keeps climbing on air." Johnny treated Burns differently than almost anyone else. Normally, Carson guided the rhythm of interviews, cutting in every 30 seconds to keep things moving. With George Burns, he'd lean back and let him go. 2 minutes, 3 minutes, sometimes longer. Johnny would just sit there, smiling, giving Burns the spotlight. And that's the highest respect Carson could give: silence, letting someone else run the show. Off camera, the bond ran even deeper. During commercial breaks, Carson usually used the time to check notes or confer with producers. But with Burns, he stayed fully engaged. Crew members said Johnny would pepper him with questions about the old days, vaudeville acts from the 1920s, long-forgotten comedians, stories about a time when show business was a grind, not a glamour. In those moments, Carson wasn't the Tonight Show host. He was a student, soaking up a private masterclass in comedy history. Burns himself noticed Johnny's affection. In his autobiography, he once wrote, "If Johnny Carson likes you, you're bulletproof in this business." And for some reason, Johnny always liked me. But the truth was simple. Burns represented everything Johnny valued: professionalism, timing, humility, and an ironclad dedication to the craft of comedy. Even into his hundreds, George Burns could walk on stage, light a cigar, deliver a line, and bring the house down. And Carson, who prided himself on precision timing and making hard work look effortless, saw Burns as the ultimate reflection of what comedy was supposed to be. That's why Johnny gave George Burns something he rarely gave anyone else: complete, unchallenged respect. In a world full of phonies and egos, Burns was the real deal. And for Johnny Carson, that made him unforgettable.